This Pete Moore on Halo Talks NYC. I have the pleasure of bringing the accomplished fitness instructor, master of many domains, a friend of yours and ours. Welcome to the Halo sector, Natalia Petrzela. You're on your first Halo Talks.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So as I was looking at your background, you've obviously taught at Equinox, you went to Columbia, you went to Stanford, you wrote some books, you've done some really interesting podcasts. So you're clearly overqualified for being on our show, so we appreciate your time. We're trying to further the Halo sector and solve loneliness, obesity, and diabetes, and we figured you might be one of the places that we could go to figure out how to do that. So maybe you could start off with some of your background and why you decided to make this your life's work.
Absolutely. And I think I saw your guest list. You got a lot of esteemed guests on here. So I'm honored to be part of the lineup. My background, academically, I'm a historian by training. I was a history major undergrad. Thought I wanted to work in magazines, but then had a lot of loans to pay off. My parents are professors, so I didn't want to be a professor. So I actually started out on Wall Street. Then I ran screaming the other direction. I was a classroom teacher, went to get my PhD in history because I just would always look around the world. And my question was always how did we get here? How did we get here? Oh. And then I realized that there's a whole job where you can spend all your time writing about how we got here. So I went to get a PhD in history, and during that whole time growing up, I was never athletic, but I found the gym when I was a teenager, fitness, not sports, totally became an important part of my life. I sort of lived a little bit of a double life where I was this very scholarly, kind of academically minded person. But then I was working at the front desk at gyms to get free memberships. I got certified, et cetera. And, long story short, now I am a history professor at the New School in New York City. And this book, Fit Nation, which is coming out in January, really brings together my work as a historian and also my deep engagement and honestly love and respect for the fitness industry. So I kind of analyze it from a historical perspective and even think about what the future might look like.
Yeah, I'm a big John Meacham listener and reader who's a political historian for the people that don't know. And I've during COVID, I basically took up as much of his content that he provided. And I will say that the one thing that upset me about him, and I try to reach out to him about this, he wrote a book and then he decided not to read his own audiobook. And I love his voice and his delivery. And I was like, how could you do that to me? You took all this time to write this history book, at least read it to me.
That's so I hope that funny.
I hope that you read your audiobook to people for someone that cares about who the voice is behind it.
I'm so happy that you say that because I actually fought to be the one reading my own audiobook, and I am going to be the only one. It's not, we haven't recorded yet, so it's coming out a little later than the hardback, but it will happen. So I'm glad to know it matters to people like you.
Yes, it definitely matters. You've obviously taken a lot of different steps. When you take a look at the history of exercise, and I started out working in a private equity fund back in 1999, and we bought Gold's Gym International, and we're trying to figure out what's the DNA of Gold's Gym, and how do we potentially modify the DNA without destroying it. One of my dumb ideas at the time was let's call it Gold's Fitness, which kind of got squashed because I didn't understand the history. And then what we did was we took the Oscar logo, which was the bodybuilder, and we basically turned that guy into a silhouette. So you didn't see all of his muscles. And we took about 40 pounds off of him. And we told all the franchisees, look, put the Oscar inside the club and put Gold's Gym on the outside, because there's some intimidation about that aspirational body that was not resonating. And now I think 55 to 60% of the members of Gold's Gym nationwide are women, which kind of changed the paradigm and the flip of what this is to others, which is the authority and not necessarily the marketing logo. So talk about what you've seen in the industry and how people have maybe, evolved over time.
Absolutely. And I love that you started with that anecdote because the first gym that I ever saved up and spent money to join was a Gold's Gym franchise. And that was it. Yeah, that was in the 1990s. And then the first gym I worked at was a World Gym location in New York City. And exactly what you're talking about, this was in the mid 90s. And it's kind of a good way in to talk about these industry changes.
Sure.
Something that I didn't know at the time, because I was just a girl behind the desk, what I didn't know I was witnessing is that World Gym, which as you know, had kind of similar DNA to Gold's Gold's Gym and being associated with bodybuilding, like that was the 90s. And they were working really hard to kind of make this transition to be like a quote unquote health club. And so what I remember seeing is that they moved all of the heavy weights to like this part of the gym that was really like far away. And then they built out a juice bar and they had this like glass walled aerobics studio that where they
Uh-huh.
started offering yoga classes too. And I remember conversations among members that were kind of like, what's happening here? Like something's really changing. And to me, that's like a good lens to understand like one important moment in this transformation in fitness in America of going from something that was like really weird to most people and a subculture that was about big dudes and like grimy basements pumping iron to being something that today we associate with one women being a huge component of the population, the client base, but also that's like building big muscles is like one tiny part of that. And there are a lot of reasons that has happened. I think it has happened as like one, exercise science has changed. Like it's a huge deal. I'm sure you know 1968, this book Aerobics comes out. Kenneth Cooper
Mhm.
writes it. Like it introduces the idea of cardio. So that's like a huge shift. But then I also think as we have come to talk about exercise as connected not to just like physical outcomes and muscle building, but to mental health, community building, and other kinds of outcomes, that's really expanded who's considered to be a likely gym goer. And so that expansion story is something that's been basically the story of fitness for the last 50 years. Yeah, for like the last 50 years, I would say.
So you've worked in the club. Sounds like you've been pretty much an avid, user of many different clubs. What worked for Gold's Gym back in the day when I first got involved was they used to have $100,000 body transformation challenge, and they had before and
Mhm.
after pictures. And I feel like a lot of the big health clubs have got so many different amenities and so many different group programming and personal training and kids care and daycare and all this other jazz that they kind of got so much in there that they kind of forgot what the messaging was or what am I really selling you? And I don't like the word sales, but what am I convincing you that, look, I am willing to get you results if you trust me and go with the process. So what do you think we're missing? Or has there been something that maybe is now an aha moment where it's like, hey, look, this is exactly what people want. If you look at Orange Theory, I want results, I want data, I want community. How do you kind of see the ideal location marketing?
Yeah, well, I think, honestly, it's such a mature and big industry that people want different things. So there's going to be different stuff that resonates with different people. But I do think you're right that we hit a kind of peak moment of like so many amenities and bells and whistles. Like I would say in markets like New York City, LA, like just before the pandemic. I mean, I remember going into a new boutique fitness place and it had like disco balls and a bar and like 7 screens and like 19 different kinds of equipment in a 45-minute class. And I was like, the hell's going on here? Like, this is just too much. And I think, obviously the pandemic in a really sad way dealt like a real body blow to the studio fitness industry. But I do think that it's pushing the kind of soul searching in the industry that you refer to, which is like, what are we really doing here? And why are people showing up? And I think part of it, yeah, results. I mean, results, what kind of results? Some people do want physical transformation. They're looking for weight loss, they're looking to build strength. But I do think that as the gym going populace has become more diverse, not everybody's looking to like lose inches. Like there are people looking to have mobility, flexibility, be able to pick up their grandchildren, people who are disabled who were never thought of as gym consumers before who want to be able to have like adaptive equipment. So I think that there is I think we're in a moment of kind of like back to basics, but I would caution against saying that basics is just like, I want the before and after bikini shop, because I do think the industry has moved on in a lot of ways from like, oh, this is just about like looking better in summer. Like, I'm glad we're kind of leaving that part behind.
Sure. Yeah. As you took a look at all the data that you put together, on the history size of the, exercise obsession, can you fill us in on some of the highlights of the book and, where you think maybe there were aha moments that maybe didn't go as planned or that we should have taken a left instead of a right?
Oh, totally. So, I mean, one thing I think is really interesting, and to me, like certainly being alive in the moment that we are, and like you guys talk about the halo industry, right? Halo suggests like that virtuous, like angelic feeling that you get from participating in exercise and recreation. So, And that's, I think, very much in keeping with like where we are today, where like if you work out, it's like you feel like you did something good. People look at you, you run marathons, oh, you must be disciplined and like a moral person. And I
Right.
subscribe to that thinking in a lot of ways. I think exercise is like objectively a good thing for the most part. One of the things that was so shocking in taking this long view, like I started in like the 1890s, is that working out used to be weird and suspicious. And if you were someone who wanted to hang out in a gym, you were suspect. And like, what did
Huh.
that look like? Well, for men, if you were somebody who cared about your appearance and your body and wanted to keep company with other men in these like weird, sweaty gym dungeons, I mean, honestly, everybody thought that you were gay, like you were
Wow.
seeking out the company of other men. And some of those gyms were really places that men seeking the company of other men would hang out. If you were a woman who wanted to exercise regularly, the idea was like, well, lifting heavy things or running or doing anything strenuous, it's going to compromise your fertility. Your uterus is going to fall out. And what kind of woman wouldn't want to have babies? You're going to get muscles, which are masculine. And this is like kind of funny, you're going to cultivate these unfeminine like character traits. You're going to be competitive and individualistic. And so anybody, and there were always people who wanted to train, right? But they were suspicious. And so when I went back into like the diaries and the writings of these early strength enthusiasts, they were like bending over backwards to be like, we're not weirdos. Like, this
Wow.
is good. Like, we shouldn't be outcasts because we like this stuff. And I found that that was just so interesting because we have pivoted like almost a 180 to today. If you say you work out, it's like, oh, you're, like, good job, good job.
Right.
So that was kind of like really interesting to me because it just speaks to like such a shift. And I think the other thing that was super interesting is like I spent a bunch of time looking at like this mid-century moment when like Eisenhower and JFK were like all in on PE, right? And it was like the middle of the Cold War. And the idea was like Americans are getting soft. Like JFK writes in Sports Illustrated about the soft American being this huge threat to national security. And like I kind of knew that story. I think a lot of people still don't, but like talking about the way that like being someone who's deconditioned and out of shape is like a moral and a civic problem. And that, like, if we're going to win the Cold War, like, we got to get in shape. And so they really got a decent amount of investment in PE. What I did not realize, which is super interesting, is that some of their main adversaries in trying to get those phys ed programs passed were like other Cold Warriors who were saying, no, 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 we need like, kids to be learning technology and science and math. And I don't know why you want them doing push ups. Like all of that work on the body is detracting from this work on the mind. Now, why
Mm.
is that interesting? If you're like a Cold War history dork, that's just like objectively interesting. But I do think it's super interesting in terms of understanding where we are today, because that fight that they were having speaks to the fact that at that time, no one was connecting body and mind. Nobody
Right.
was saying, hey, if these kids are more fit, they're going to do better at school. They're going to be better adjusted. That's an asset. Like nobody was making that connection. The presumption was if these kids are spending time running sprints and climbing ropes and all of that, okay, they might be more fit as soldiers, but they are not, they're going to be losing out on the intellectual side. And I think a big story of how we got to where we are today is now we consider training the body as interconnected with like training the mind, and that we have that kind of like holistic sense. And
It's
I
it's
overall
it,
think that's good.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting you bring that up because on ESPN they just had a 150-year history of college football, and college football was really first started by the Ivy Leagues to basically keep men stronger in order
Totally.
to not have them become soft. And then it got so violent to the point where FDR basically had all the deans of the Ivy League schools come to the White House and said, "Look, if you don't clean this up, I'm gonna prohibit it." And
Hmm.
that's basically what started from a running game and like gang tackling. There were literally like people that would die during
I
a
know.
football game in college. And then, he said, "Hey, you got to clean this up." And that's what basically started the forward pass, was to open up the field so they wouldn't have people, gang tackling and being on top of each other. So it's interesting how that, you say like, "Hey, I've got great minds that are in the Ivy League. I want them stronger, but at the same time, I'm not connecting the mind and the body. I'm just trying to now protect the body, even though I don't want softness."
Oh, 100%. And it's super interesting. That whole I take this up in my book because like a lot of times in our culture, we kind of separate sports and fitness, but like we're living through all of it at the same time. And so at that same time that, folks in the Ivy League are fighting about like football and what that should look like, they're also like building these recreation and intramural programs, which actually engage a lot more people. But because as a culture, we tend to care more about like big game football as a history than like somebody going and walking around a track. We don't tend to know as much about that past. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
So, as you take a look at the fact that, only 20% of the people exercise, before COVID, I heard some stat or a directive on behalf of a casual dining restaurant that they were going to make the booths bigger to accommodate larger people. That just kind of said, all right, here's like an epidemic, and we're going to basically, lean into the epidemic to allow people to be bigger. Obviously, and maybe this is a little bit of a touchy subject, but being obese, in 95% of the cases, obviously you got people that have thyroid issues and they're on medications that don't allow them to do certain things. Most of that is a lifestyle choice. It's a decision. It's a lack of discipline. And you can either treat that as a society with kids' gloves, or you can treat it as a potential penalty. If you get auto insurance and you have a clean auto record, you get 15% off your auto insurance. There's incentives that companies are using now to say, hey, if you don't smoke and you do a certain amount of steps a day and you do other things that make you a healthier employee, that's obviously going to turn into a lower insurance claim against me as the company that's providing it. So how do you kind of look and say, we're in this kind of, politically correct era of him, her, he, she, we, I, whatever that is on LinkedIn. I'm not really sure. However, at the same time, we got a problem. We got to address this problem head on, and letting it go is not the way to do it. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is so
Obviously, you don't
complicated.
mind.
Yeah, yeah, I hear yours. And this is sometimes when I say, well, I'm not that kind of doctor, right? I have a PhD in history. I'm not an obesity specialist, but no, obviously I care deeply and know something about these issues. So what I think is that like, yeah, you're absolutely right that like to a certain extent, like obesity and any sort of like lifestyle related illness is a question of choices, right? And of the choices that we make every day of what we put in our bodies, whether we move, whether we don't, et cetera. On the other hand, something that I try to push, and I want to acknowledge that like full stop, because there are people who say, that's not, how dare you say that? That's just fat shaming. And I think that that is unproductive. I do think, though, at the same time, like particularly in the kind of fitness and diet industry, often we act like individual choice is the only thing. And that if you're not making those choices, well, then you look a particular way and it's all on you. And I think that that's not right because I do think, like, let's just stay in the realm of exercise, but food too, depending on like, where you live, how much money you have, the kind of job you have, et cetera. It's just a lot harder to make those choices to live a healthy lifestyle and have a body that, reflects it for certain people than for others. I mean, in a very like small example of that, I think of the fact like, the running world, and I've run marathons. I like love running and everything, but that's probably the part of the fitness industry where that language of like, all it takes is willpower and discipline and a pair of sneakers. It's like very loud, right? And in some ways it's accurate. You don't need a whole health club membership to run. But I even think like I have so many privileges, like where I live, et cetera, what
Sure.
I look like. But like my husband, who's 6'3", can decide to go running at 5 a.m. in the dark, at night, everything. I will tell you, I go running outside only when it's light out. I got my headphones turned down and I live in a very safe neighborhood. And I think about that. What would it mean if I was Black? What would it mean if I lived in a neighborhood with no streetlights? Like, and I think that's one example of the fact it's just that much harder to make those personal choices for a lot of folks. And
So,
of course, a lot of people do. I mean, someone I've written about who I admire tremendously is this guy, Cos Marti, who was in prison and was
yeah,
obese
yeah,
and
we
was going to,
interviewed him. Great guy. Yeah. Con body.
amazing guy.
Yeah.
Such a I love his work too, like just to shout him out a little bit because he is that example of someone in the worst circumstance who did make those personal choices against all these barriers, transformed his body, built a business. Well, one of the things I really appreciate about his work is like he's super aware of all of the structural factors that make it really freaking hard to do the extraordinary thing that he did. And so I think like we've got to find a way to talk about obesity and health and like morality, quite honestly, that isn't just about like like, huh, well, you look that way, like make better choices, because I don't think that's fair. I have childcare, I have, all of these things make it easier to work out and to eat healthy food. It's cheaper to eat
Yeah.
non-healthy food. So I think that's super important.
I mean, one of the things that you brought up, which I've never really put these three words together, but fitness choices is a social justice issue.
A
And
hundred
as I
percent.
think back to how health club operators or boutique operators find real estate, okay? And they do look, tell me what the household income is and the density over a 3 mile radius, over a 5 mile radius. I mean, if you want to talk about discriminatory algorithms, like bam, there you go. That's the first one you can look at. So, that necessarily doesn't drive profitability because the rents in lower income markets are obviously much lower. But there's a choice to go in and say, okay, the Equinox once said, you'll find Equinox in the top markets, but you're never going to find us in Albuquerque. It was said as a joke, but I mean, it was serious.
Yeah,
So when you think about, the democratization of fitness,
for sure.
um, is there, and there are some companies like Retro Fitness right now has got like an urban program that they're setting up where a percentage of the royalty goes back to the community. Um, but how do we kind of like get a capitalist society to start to say, hey, maybe I have an obligation to go into these neighborhoods, not necessarily like what the Buxton, report says on like what my scoring is at real estate.
Oh, totally. It's the perfect question. I mean, and I think that there are a bunch of answers to it. First of all, like I'm enough of a capitalist to say it's no business owner's like responsibility to solve this problem, or like Equinox, where I taught, where I'm a member, does a good job at serving a particular clientele. And honestly, part of what they're doing is equating fitness and a luxury experience. And like that works for them. And okay, great. Now, of course, in their portfolio is also Blink Fitness, right? Which is in lower income neighborhoods and sells something that works in that demographic as well. I think that, I think it's I think it's important that there be an aspect or a dimension of the fitness industry that is not just about like elitism and health is interconnected, because I do think that's something that really, really sells. I mean, that's what motivated the whole boutique sector. You're in this special, very expensive luxury space. Those kinds of brands are never going to open in lower income neighborhoods or make themselves less accessible or have people in their advertising that are bigger or older or whatever, because it's not cool. What they're selling is exclusivity. However, I'd like to think that there's money to be made, quite honestly, in serving a lower income market and in messaging and marketing that makes fitness accessible. And there are businesses doing that. I mean, Zumba is like a big success story in that
Sure.
regard in doing that. And I think that there's something good. That being said, like I'm enough of like I don't know, socialist, a social democrat at least, to say that I don't think the answer to fitness and equality in this country is going to come from like, business owners doing the right thing. This is why I'm such a champion for investing in physical education, and physical education that's actually like inspiring and like good and rigorous as well and inclusive at the same time. We're seeing PE chopped left and right. That's where most kids are going to encounter exercise. The other thing that I'm like an evangelist about is safe parks and community recreation spaces.
Sure.
Like that is so freaking important. If you know that in your community, you can walk a few blocks, there's a well-lit park where one kid can play basketball, the moms can walk around the track, there's a tennis court, there's a pool. I mean, that's the kind of thing that makes fitness part of everyday life and a lifestyle, not just a consumer commodity. And I think to me, that is like, it's a real tragedy in our society. Like basically everyone agrees exercise is good for you. Like, that's why it's the halo effect. Like, oh, you work out, it's good. We agree that, but we don't agree strenuously enough to be like, this is a right of citizenship or that this is
Yeah.
something that
Yeah.
should be a public good. And that I think is a problem.
Yeah, anytime I see a basketball court that doesn't have a net on the rim, I feel like that's a disservice to kids across that community. I mean, you shouldn't
Yeah.
have to decide, did that ball go in or was that bank shot, in or out? Like I felt like at some point somebody should put nets up on all those, and as they need to get replaced, to get replaced. And those are like the little things that I think make a difference. But listen, I want to make sure everybody gets info on your book. So if you want to just give a little tag about that, and we'll view this as kind of like the teaser to the release, which is just still January 6th. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. There's been some
Awesome.
production delays, but it should be. Yes. So it's called Fit Nation, The Gains and Pains of America's Exercise Obsession. And it goes from like the 1890s through the pandemic and Peloton. And I think that folks in this industry will find it really interesting. I interviewed a lot of people who are around today and also did a ton of archival work. So it's available now for pre-order anywhere books are sold.
Awesome. Well, it's great to have you on. Look forward to meeting you in person. Keep doing what you're doing. And,
Thank
in time, we will change the world and we will be living the realism of the Halo sector. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. This was really fun.